The winter of 1849 hung heavy over St. Petersburg. The streets were gray with frozen mud, and smoke drifted low over the Neva like the breath of something tired of living. Inside a narrow apartment, a thin young man sat at a desk cluttered with papers, each page trembling with the urgency of a mind that refused to be quiet. His name was Fyodor Dostoevsky, a former engineer, a failed reformer, and a man already at war with his own soul. He had been raised in faith, trained in reason, and driven by a pity. He believed, once, that ideas could save the world. That was before the prisons, before exile, before he learned that the mind is a cage built of its own logic. For now, he still wrote passionately. Pamphlets of justice, stories of the poor, unaware that the next knock at his door would change his life forever. Outside, the empire he loved and feared was rotting from within. Tsar Nicholas ruled with iron certainty. The streets whispered of rebellion. Intellectuals gathered in small apartments to dream of freedom, and the police listened through the walls. Dostoevsky, restless and idealistic, joined one of those gatherings, the Petrashevsky Circle, where men debated socialism's religion and the future of the human spirit. To discuss ideas was not yet a crime, to believe in them was. The arrest. At dawn on April 23, 1849, soldiers burst through his door. They overturned his desk, scattered his manuscripts, and dragged him out into the cold. He was 27 years old. Within days, he found himself in a fortress cell, cut off from the world, condemned for the crime of thinking too freely. The silence inside those walls was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that grows until it begins to speak. He could hear his own heartbeat, echoing like a metronome of dread. He prayed not for mercy, but for meaning, that his suffering might somehow be used. What he did not yet know was that the silence of that cell would become the birthplace of all his novels, the crucible where his philosophy of the soul would be forged. Months later, the prisoners were lined up in the square. Snowflakes melted on their lashes. A priest read their final rites. Blindfolds were tied. Rifles were raised. And just before the command to fire, a messenger arrived. A last-minute pardon from the Tsar. The execution was a show. The reprieve, a lesson. Dostoevsky would spend the next 4 years in a Siberian labor camp, learning what it meant to live after one has already died. The silence after death. In Siberia, the world shrank to a cell of dirt and frost. The prisoners were murderers, thieves, and men who no longer spoke of hope. Yet among them, Dostoevsky found something unexpected: faith. Not the faith of philosophers, but of peasants who crossed themselves before every meal, who believed in forgiveness because they had nothing else left. He began to see that suffering was not the opposite of grace, but its doorway. That man's greatness lay not in his strength, but in his ability to repent. He wrote later, "To be too aware is sickness, but to love in that sickness, that is salvation." The silence that had once crushed him began to change shape. It became the space where he could listen to the cries of others, to the voice of conscience, and finally, to the faint pulse of God. The return. When he was released years later, St. Petersburg no longer looked the same. The city's grandeur felt hollow, the laughter of the salons unbearable. The man who returned was not the same as the one who had been taken. He carried the frost of Siberia in his eyes and a new conviction in his heart, that every soul, no matter how corrupted, is capable of resurrection. He no longer trusted ideologies. He had seen what they do when they forget compassion. Instead, he turned inward, toward the mystery of freedom, guilt, and redemption. He began to write again, not as a reformer, but as a witness. Each page became a confession, each character a fragment of himself. Raskolnikov, the murderer seeking forgiveness, Prince Mishkin, the idiot who loves purely, Ivan Karamazov, the skeptic who cannot forgive God. All of them were echoes of the man who had once stood before a firing squad. The Deneurbishring, the Dashisi, the silence of his youth, had become a voice. Trembling, relentless, human. He no longer wrote to change society. He wrote to understand the soul that creates it. What is freedom? What is love? Why do we destroy the things we need most? These questions haunted him more than any political cause. Dostoevsky had begun his life believing in the revolution of the mind. He would spend the rest of it seeking the revolution of the heart. And so begins our story, the journey of a man who descended into hell and returned with the language of mercy. Because sometimes the greatest revelations do not come in thunder or fire. They come in the silence after the last shot is fired, when a man realizes he has been given back his life. Not to possess it, but to understand it. When Dostoevsky returned from Siberia, he carried no luggage, only ghosts. The frost had carved itself into his nerves. Every sudden noise made him flinch. He had survived the mines, the disease, the humiliation. But what lingered was the silence. The terrible calm that follows pain too vast to name. He was free, yet he was never truly free again. Inside him, the torment had taken shape, a living contradiction, half faith and half doubt. He had looked into the abyss of human cruelty and seen himself reflected there. The experience had burned away the idealism of youth and left behind a trembling, searching soul, one who could no longer believe in simple answers, yet could not stop yearning for them. The return to a world that no longer fit. St. Petersburg greeted him like a dream seen through cracked glass. The salons were full again, the chatter of progress and reason louder than ever. But he no longer believed in progress. He had seen too much of what civilization hides beneath its manners. Hunger, loneliness, the casual cruelty of men who call themselves enlightened. He wandered the streets at night, coughing into his scarf, listening to the echo of horse hooves on the cobblestones. The city shimmered with lights, but for him, every lamp felt like a small act of defiance against darkness, a fragile glow that could vanish at any moment. He began to write again, but now his sentences bled. His first stories after exile were full of guilt and trembling grace, portraits of men who crave salvation and fear it at the same time. Critics dismissed him as hysterical. He didn't care. He wasn't writing for them. He was writing to stay alive. The marriage of pain and vision. In 1857, he married Maria Isyeva, a fragile woman, beautiful and ill. Their love was desperate, haunted by sickness and poverty. She loved him fiercely, but never understood him. He, in turn, oscillated between devotion and exhaustion. Their life together was a slow collapse, punctuated by moments of unbearable tenderness. During those years, Dostoevsky began to realize something that would define all his future work: that suffering does not destroy love, it reveals its depth. The more he saw of human weakness, the more he became convinced that compassion was the only bridge strong enough to cross the abyss between souls. He wrote to a friend, "The darker the night, the brighter the stars. The deeper the grief, the closer is God." That line was not a metaphor, it was a survival instinct. The birth of the torment epilepsy came like a thief. The first seizure struck him without warning. One moment he was speaking, the next he was gone, body convulsing, consciousness ripped away. When he awoke, he felt both terror and revelation. For a second before every attack, he said, he experienced a vision of perfect harmony, an instant so pure that it justified all the agony that followed. He called it the supreme moment, and it became his metaphor for the human condition, the flash of divine clarity that cost the soul its peace. That paradox, ecstasy and suffering intertwined, became the rhythm of his existence. Every fit reminded him how fragile consciousness truly is. Every recovery reminded him how precious it is to be awake. The gambler's curse. As if to balance the involuntary chaos of his illness, Dostoevsky sought control elsewhere, in the fever of gambling. The roulette wheel became his confession booth, his battlefield, his mirror. Each spin carried both hope and self-destruction. He won just enough to keep losing. He would pawn his coat, his watch, even his wife's belongings, promising each time that this would be the last bet. But the truth was simpler. In gambling, he reenacted the moral drama that obsessed him, the struggle between freedom and fate. Each turn of the wheel was a miniature version of existence itself. Absolute freedom contained within absolute chance. When the ball spun, time stopped. For a few seconds, he felt God listening, the man between heaven and hell. By his mid-30s, Dostoevsky was living in perpetual contradiction. He preached compassion, but hurt the ones he loved. He despised materialism, but chased money to survive. He sought spiritual peace, but lived in chaos. And yet, it was from that chaos that his greatest vision began to emerge. He had seen the face of the criminal and recognized his own reflection. He had lived among sinners and found them more honest than saints. He began to understand that the line between good and evil does not divide nations or classes. It runs through every human heart. That realization did not comfort him. It condemned him to endless empathy. He could never again hate cleanly. Every villain carried a whisper of redemption. Every saint, a shadow of hypocrisy. His gift was not moral clarity, it was moral compassion. Toward the fire, in 1864, death returned. His wife Maria died slowly, and his beloved brother Mikhail soon after. He was left with debts, grief, and manuscripts that few wanted to publish. He was 38, bankrupt, sick, and alone. But inside that darkness, a voice began to rise. The voice that would soon write notes from underground, and then Crime and Punishment. It was the voice of a man who no longer sought to justify life, but to expose it. He would write not to comfort, but to awaken. Not to preach, but to confess. The tormented soul that Siberia had forged was now ready to speak, and the world was about to listen. By the mid-1860s, the world around Dostoevsky was trembling. Empires were cracking under their own weight. Revolutions smoldered beneath the cobblestones. Paris burned with ideas. London hummed with machines. And Russia, vast and sleepless, stood between two centuries. One dying, one not yet born. Dostoevsky, always restless, felt the heat of that transformation from far away. The same fire that lit the barricades of Europe now flickered inside his skull. He had seen what idealism could do when it was fed by cruelty, and what faith could do when stripped of compassion. He was a man torn between heaven and earth, between the dream of reason and the chaos of the human heart. A world in flames. In Paris, Karl Marx wrote of history's inevitable justice. In Germany, Nietzsche was still a child. Across Europe, the age of metaphysics was collapsing. Science and economics were replacing the soul with statistics. And yet, in every cafe, people still whispered about salvation. Dostoevsky read the newspapers like a man eavesdropping on the apocalypse. He saw the headlines of progress and heard only prophecy. The same optimism that promised equality also promised the death of the soul. They will build paradise, he wrote, but it will be built of corpses. To him, Paris was not a city, it was a warning. He imagined its glittering boulevards as the surface of a volcano, bright with laughter and gaslight, while the molten despair of the poor seethed beneath. The fire of revolution was both holy and destructive. It purified and consumed. The return to writing. After years of debt and despair, Dostoevsky began to write again with furious intensity. The silence of Siberia had ripened into vision. He had learned that one cannot understand man by reason alone. One must understand his contradictions. So, he wrote of contradiction itself. His desk was a battlefield. Scraps of dialogue, fragments of prayers, the smell of tobacco and candle wax. He no longer wrote to persuade, he wrote to confess. The new novel that took shape was unlike anything before it. Part confession, part accusation, part resurrection. That book would become Crime and Punishment. The spark of the idea. The story came to him as a fever dream. A poor student, brilliant and desperate, murders an old pawnbroker to test a theory that some men have the right to kill for a higher purpose. The crime is simple. The punishment, endless. It was not merely fiction. Raskolnikov was the shadow Dostoevsky saw in every modern man, the one who believes in morality without God, reason without mercy. The story was not about a murderer, but about the death of conscience in an age drunk on logic. As he wrote, Dostoevsky felt both the thrill and terror of creation. He was dissecting his own soul. Every page was a confession disguised as philosophy. He was not judging Raskolnikov, he was forgiving him. Fire and redemption. When the novel was published in 1866, it exploded across Russia like a sermon wrapped in dynamite. The intellectuals hated its mysticism. The peasants wept over its mercy. Everyone read it. Everyone argued. Some saw it as a warning against revolution, others as a defense of compassion. Dostoevsky smiled at both. He had not written propaganda, he had written prophecy. Through Raskolnikov, he declared what he had learned in prison, that no ideology can cleanse the heart, only love can. That freedom without humility becomes cruelty, and reason without forgiveness becomes madness. He was still in debt, still sick, still haunted by seizures, but something within him had ignited. For the first time since Siberia, he believed that art could redeem suffering, that by telling the truth about despair, one might help another soul endure it. The exile of the spirit. Shortly after Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky fled Russia to escape his creditors. He traveled through Germany, Switzerland, and France, carrying only his manuscripts, his guilt, and the ache of unfinished prayers. He wandered like a penitent ghost among the cities of Europe, the very capitals that claimed to have outgrown God. He watched the crowds in Paris and felt nothing but pity. They are happy, he wrote in his notebook, but their happiness is built on sand. They will not withstand the first storm. He was not mocking them, he was mourning them, because he saw in their laughter the same emptiness that lived within him, the hunger that no pleasure could satisfy, the loneliness that progress could not cure. Anna, and then a miracle. In 1866, a young stenographer named Anna Snitkina entered his life. He was 45, she was 20. He hired her to help him finish The Gambler. But what she gave him was far more than work. She gave him order, faith, and forgiveness. She saw through the chaos and loved him anyway. She accepted the seizures, the debts, the sleepless nights. With her, he rediscovered something he had long buried: peace. Anna became his confessor, his editor, his salvation. Together they would wander Europe again, still poor but finally alive. "You have resurrected me," he told her, and he meant it. The fire that purifies. As revolution spread across the continent, Dostoevsky no longer saw himself as a reformer, but as a survivor. And he understood now that every human being carries two fires, one that burns to destroy, and one that burns to purify. Civilization depends on which flame we choose to feed. The fire of Paris, the political fire, would rise and fall. But the fire of compassion, the one he had glimpsed in the faces of convicts and in Anna's patience, that was the eternal flame. The one that could not be extinguished by logic or revolution. He began to believe that the future of humanity would depend not on systems or revolts, but on the quiet work of the soul, the endless task of learning to love what is broken. And so, through all the smoke and noise of history, Dostoevsky kept listening for that quiet voice, the one that speaks only when the world grows silent enough to hear it. By the late 1860s, Dostoevsky had become a man living between two empires, one political, the other invisible. The first was the Empire of Russia, bureaucratic, brutal, and vast. The second was the Empire of Ideas, a new faith rising across Europe, where science and reason had dethroned the divine. Everywhere he looked, he saw machines, factories, systems, institutions, ideologies, all promising to make the world better by making man predictable. But Dostoevsky knew that the heart is not a mechanism. He had lived among the broken gears of progress, the prisons, the revolutions, the gambling halls, and he knew what happened when people tried to build perfection out of pain. The machine always breaks, and when it breaks, it crushes the human being who built it. The age of the calculated soul. In Petersburg, the newspapers spoke the language of mathematics. Society, they said, was an equation waiting to be solved. Poverty could be eliminated, crime eradicated, morality automated. If only people could be educated, organized, reprogrammed. Dostoevsky read those words and shuddered. He had seen men stripped of freedom in the name of justice, and men stripped of conscience in the name of reason. They will build a paradise of numbers, he wrote, and call it peace. The new generation of intellectuals worshiped the idea of a flawless society, where laws replaced love and logic replaced faith. But Dostoevsky saw the trap. A world without suffering might also be a world without compassion. To remove pain was to remove the possibility of redemption. The machinery of power was not made of metal, it was made of certainty. Notes from Underground. In 1864, he published Notes from Underground, a book so strange and so raw that critics barely knew how to describe it. It was not a novel, nor a confession, nor a sermon. It was a scream. The narrator, the underground man, is bitter, self-aware, and painfully honest. He mocks reason, mocks virtue, mocks himself. He lives in the basement of modern civilization, hating the world and hating his own hatred. Through him, Dostoevsky gave voice to the part of humanity that logic cannot cure. The underground man knows the formulas of happiness, but cannot stop sabotaging himself. He is the human soul caught in a machine it cannot believe in. I say, let me suffer, he cries, so long as I may exist. That single line became the seed of existentialism. It was a declaration of war against the mechanical vision of man. To suffer, to choose, to err, these are not defects. They are the essence of freedom. The invisible prison. What terrified Dostoevsky most was not the tyranny of kings, but the tyranny of ideas. He believed that the 19th century had invented a new kind of prison, one without walls. A prison of rationality, comfort, and social conformity. He saw it everywhere, in the smiling bureaucrat, in the obedient worker, in the polite citizen who does not question the moral cost of progress. They were not enslaved by force, but by convenience, and in that convenience, the soul was dying. The greatest temptation, he wrote, is not evil, but order. Because order gives the illusion of peace, while slowly strangling the capacity for love. For Dostoevsky, true freedom was not the absence of suffering. It was the courage to suffer for what is right. That was the rebellion of the underground man, not against society, but against spiritual sleep. The face of power. In his travels across Europe, Dostoevsky attended political meetings where men spoke of brotherhood and justice. He listened, nodding, but inside he felt a chill. Their words were noble, but their eyes were empty. They dreamed of a world purified of sin, a heaven built by reason, But a heaven built without compassion becomes a machine, and every machine requires fuel. The fuel, Dostoevsky feared, would be human souls. He began to understand that totalitarianism is born not from cruelty, but from utopia. It begins with the promise of happiness for all, and ends with the sacrifice of anyone who does not fit the plan. And so, he wrote again and again that there can be no paradise built by power, because the moment love is enforced, it ceases to be love. The Writer and the Machine. He once walked through a Paris factory where hundreds of workers moved in silence beneath the hiss of steam. Their faces were gray, their hands identical. Watching them, Dostoevsky felt an almost religious dread. Here was the future. A world where men became extensions of the machine, their individuality dissolved in productivity. He saw in those rows of exhausted faces the death of the soul. And in that moment, he understood the deepest paradox of progress, that every step toward control is also a step away from compassion. He returned to his hotel and wrote for hours, trembling with fever. If man is only the sum of his conditions, he wrote, then to save him, we must destroy him. That sentence would later echo through all his novels, the terrible knowledge that the very systems created to save humanity could end up erasing it. The machinery. Within. But Dostoevsky was too honest to believe that evil lived only in society. He saw the same machinery inside himself, the gears of pride, fear, and vanity turning endlessly. The gambler's table, the writer's ambition, the lover's jealousy. They were all forms of power disguised as passion. He began to write not only about politics, but about psychology, about the machinery within the heart, the forces that drive us to dominate, to submit, to control even those we love. He realized that tyranny begins not with governments, but with the human desire to be right. That realization terrified him, but it also freed him. Because if the machinery of power begins within, then perhaps so does redemption. The vision beyond the system. By the time he finished The Idiot in 1869, Dostoevsky had written his antidote to the machine. Prince Myshkin, naive, kind, pure, is a man who refuses to play by the rules of power. His goodness is not strategy, it is weakness turned into light. And for that, the world destroys him. Through Myshkin, Dostoevsky asked the question that would haunt him until death. Can goodness survive in a world built on strength? The answer, he suspected, was no. But he also believed that even one act of love, even one refusal to dominate, is enough to prove that humanity is still divine. And so, amid the roar of engines and ideologies, he continued to whisper the same quiet rebellion, that the only real revolution begins in the heart, and the only true power is compassion. By the 1870s, Russia had begun to awaken to the fever of the modern age. Factories multiplied along the Neva, railways slithered through the snow, and advertisements for Paris fashions glimmered in shop windows. The empire was learning to speak the language of money and forgetting the language of mercy. Dostoevsky watched it all from the window of his modest apartment. The glitter of commerce, the gray faces of workers, the new religion of material success. He felt the pulse of something intoxicating and monstrous rising across Europe, a force that promised freedom but produced hunger, promised progress but deepened loneliness. That force was capital, and what it bought was the human soul. The birth of the marketplace mind. The great revolution of the 19th century had promised equality. What arrived instead was competition. The age of the machine had given birth to a new species, the economic man, who measured his worth not by virtue or compassion, but by profit. Dostoevsky saw this new creature everywhere, in the banker who preached morality while speculating on famine, in the writer who traded truth for applause, in himself, when he gambled away the last of his money, hoping to feel, for one instant, like God. To him, capitalism was not merely an economic system. It was a spiritual experiment. Could a society built on greed still produce goodness? Could the human heart remain tender when every relationship became a transaction? He suspected not. They will sell everything, he wrote bitterly, even their tears. The new isolation. In the cities, Dostoevsky saw crowds growing and souls shrinking. The more people gathered, the lonelier they became. The marketplace, that miracle of modern life, offered connection without intimacy, pleasure without purpose. It promised abundance, but delivered alienation. The very streets that once rang with sermons now echoed with bargains. The church bell and the factory whistle began to sound alike, both calling men to labor, both measuring worth in output. He wrote in his notebook, "When man worships bread alone, he loses his hunger for heaven." The tragedy, for Dostoevsky, was not that people were poor, but that they no longer believed in anything greater than comfort. Poverty of faith frightened him far more than poverty of coin. The Gospel of Gold. When he traveled through Western Europe, Dostoevsky visited the glittering arcades of Paris and the banks of London. He saw the cathedrals of finance, their marble pillars, their solemn clerks, and realized that capitalism had created its own form of worship. The altar was wealth, the sacrament, consumption. He was horrified and fascinated. In those cities, he felt both admiration for their discipline and despair for their emptiness. "These people have conquered the world," he wrote, "but not themselves." He saw that money had replaced both God and revolution as the meaning of existence. The worker no longer dreamed of heaven. He dreamed of wages. The intellectual no longer preached truth. He preached relevance. The soul had become an investment, and like any investment, it could fail. The mask of freedom capitalism, Dostoevsky believed, offered the illusion of freedom, the freedom to buy, to sell, to choose. But beneath that glitter lay a deeper slavery, the tyranny of desire. Men who once bowed before kings now bowed before appetite. The marketplace promised autonomy, but it required obedience. Obedience to envy, to fashion, to endless hunger. He understood this not through theory, but through addiction. When he gambled, he felt the same fever he saw in society, that need for risk, for the brief illusion of control. The roulette table was a perfect miniature of the modern world, every man alone, competing against chance, believing that wealth could erase guilt. It was not money that fascinated Dostoevsky. It was what money did to the soul. It made man feel infinite while making him smaller. It taught him to calculate everything, except grace. The disintegration of faith. In The Possessed, or Demons, Dostoevsky portrayed a generation intoxicated by ideology and money alike. Young radicals who believed they could engineer happiness. Behind their words of justice burned a hidden fire, the will to power. They wanted to remake humanity as one remakes a machine. But Dostoevsky, having seen the inside of such dreams, understood what they could not, that every utopia built without love will end in ashes. He feared that capitalism and socialism were merely two faces of the same godless faith, systems that reduced man to an instrument. "Man does not live by bread alone," he repeated again and again, "but by the mystery of being human." That mystery, he saw, was being priced out of existence. The saint of poverty. In his later novels, Dostoevsky began to write not about wealth, but about the poor, the broken, the forgotten, the invisible. He saw in them something sacred that prosperity destroys. Dependence, humility, the raw courage to forgive. Characters like Sonia in Crime and Punishment, or Aliosha in the Brothers Karamazov live without possessions. Yet they possess the one thing the rich have lost: compassion. Through them, he revealed a paradox: that the true wealth of man lies in his capacity to love, even when he has nothing to give. Love in action, he wrote, is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. And yet, it was the only force that could redeem the age of capital, the soul under capital. As Dostoevsky grew older, his criticism of modernity deepened into prophecy. He foresaw an age where everything, even truth, would be commodified. He predicted a time when people would buy identities, sell beliefs, and worship comfort as the highest virtue. That time, he warned, would not come with violence, but with convenience. They will chain themselves with golden chains, he wrote, and call it freedom. The tragedy of capitalism, in his eyes, was not poverty, but amnesia, the forgetting of the soul. Because when man ceases to seek meaning, he becomes what he worships: a consumer, endlessly hungry and never full. The flicker of redemption. And yet, even in that despair, Dostoevsky refused to hate the world. He saw the same hunger in the capitalist and the convict, the same yearning for love in both sinner and saint. His faith did not come from denial, but from recognition, the belief that even the most corrupted heart still carries a spark of the divine. He wrote not to condemn the marketplace, but to remind it of its soul. The secret of man, he said, is not that he lives, but that he is willing to die for something. In a world obsessed with buying and selling, that willingness to sacrifice, to forgive, to love, became his rebellion. It was the antidote to alienation, the rediscovery of the sacred in the ordinary. And in that rebellion, Dostoevsky found his purpose again: to write not for progress, but for salvation. Not to save the world, but to remind it that it still has one. When Dostoevsky returned from Siberia, he did not return to the same century. The clock still ticked, and the snow still fell, but the spirit of Europe had shifted. Steam engines roared across fields that once heard only the wind. Accounting books replaced psalms. Philosophy turned practical. Politics turned mathematical. In salons and student cellars, young men declared that humanity would soon be engineered, made rational, efficient, and happy. The future would be designed like a bridge. Dostoevsky had seen a different blueprint of the human soul. In barracks and prison yards, he watched men reduced to their functions: digging, hauling, sleeping, obeying, and he discovered something that terrified him more than chains. A man can be turned into a cog without noticing. If you teach him that he is nothing but matter and appetite, he begins to live as if the soul were a rumor. He becomes smooth, predictable, measurable. He becomes useful. St. Petersburg seemed to him like a rehearsal for that future. Gaslight washed the canals in a pallid glow. Shuttered faces drifted past one another like files in a ledger. Newspapers celebrated positive science and the physiology of morality. If conscience could be traced to nerves and love to chemistry, then ethics, politics, even art could be administered by experts. The age promised a paradise of causes and effects. Repair the housing, reform the wages, calibrate the schools. People would behave. Sin would be solved like a plumbing problem. He did not mock reform. He feared the metaphysics behind it, the theory that man is nothing but his circumstances. Dostoevsky had lived among killers who wept over stray dogs, among thieves who gave away their last crust of bread, among the indifferent who became gentle in the presence of pain. He knew environment matters. He also knew something deeper stirs beneath it. The soul resisted being graphed. In a notebook, he scrawled a warning: if you build a flawless, rational order, the first human act will be to put a crack in it, just to prove we are not stones. That line became the heartbeat of a new kind of character, the human being who rejects salvation by system. He had met this figure in himself, the underground man, who would rather suffer freely than prosper as a spreadsheet. Freedom, Dostoevsky realized, includes the right to be wrong, to love what is useless, to forgive what is undeserved. A world that forbids those things may be clean, but it will not be human. He began to see a machine where others saw progress, not a device of iron, but a culture without transcendence. In that machine, every value must be justified by utility. Mercy is tolerated if it increases stability. Art is tolerated if it sells. Religion is tolerated if it behaves. What cannot be counted is quietly starved. The result is not tyranny in the old sense, boots and batons, but a softer erasure, the disappearance of meanings that cannot prove their worth on a balance sheet. Dostoevsky answered this machine not with manifestos, but with stories. He gave it Raskolnikov, a student who murders in the name of an idea, convinced that certain extraordinary men may step across corpses for the greater good. He gave it the underground man, who sabotages his own happiness to defend his right to desire the irrational. He gave it Ivan Karamazov, who refuses a ticket to any heaven built upon the tears of a child. Through them, he staged the secret trials the century avoided. Not which policy works, but what becomes of a conscience in a world that worships results. Often he imagined the coming city, productive, gleaming, humane by decree. In that city, he heard the quiet weeping that statistics cannot detect, the weeping of people who had been explained too thoroughly. To be told you are only matter is to be told that your guilt is misfiring. Guilt, your love is successful mating behavior, your tragedy a neurological storm. Explanation can be a mercy. It can also be a theft. It steals the dignity of saying, I am responsible. Without that sentence, redemption becomes a metaphor. He wrote of this theft with tenderness, not scorn. He knew how seductive the machine could be, especially to the compassionate. If suffering is a technical failure, then all energy belongs to engineers and legislators. Priests and poets, those awkward custodians of meaning, become decorative. But he had learned among convicts that the soul does not vanish when systems improve. A man can sleep in a clean bed, eat enough bread, and still wake at 3 a.m. asking why he has betrayed himself. No blueprint answers that hour. Sometimes he casts the machine in theological light. The machine is what remains when the Father disappears, but the need for authority persists. In the Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor tells Christ that freedom is a burden, and that the Church, out of mercy, will relieve the masses of it. Dostoevsky recognized the same bargain in politics. Exchange liberty for certainty, conscience for comfort, personhood for policy. The shape changes, crown, committee, algorithm, but the logic is identical. Someone else will carry your soul for you. He also noticed a new kind of violence, the violence of abstraction. In Demons, he shows how ideas, once cut loose from compassion, begin to feed on people. A student becomes a symbol, a death becomes a message. For the future, the radicals say, as they push a gentleman into a pond. Dostoevsky was not defending the old order. He was defending the uncountable worth of a single face. You cannot love mankind. You can love a person. Machines love mankind. What then is the ghost in the machine? Not a specter that haunts technology, but a personhood that refuses to be compressed into purpose. It appears when a murderer kneels and asks to be forgiven, when a woman degraded by necessity becomes the moral center of a book, when a hungry child's tear outweighs a whole philosophy. The ghost is the stubborn claim, quiet as prayer, that life is not exhausted by the reasons for it. Dostoevsky's answer was radical humility. Keep the crack open. Permit mystery. Leave room in every system for what cannot be coerced. Repentance, grace, the miracle of a will that turns. He did not propose chaos. He proposed reverence. If a policy works but withers souls, it fails. If a theory explains much but erases guilt and love, it lies. He believes society must be repaired, fiercely and concretely, but it must never be designed as if people were programmable animals. The city must be built for saints who fall and sinners who rise. And so he wrote, against sleep, against debt, against illness, the way a man rows against a current he knows he cannot reverse. He had no illusions of winning. The machine would keep humming. The world would grow brighter and emptier. Yet he kept telling the same scandalous story, that a single confession can reconfigure a universe, that a kiss can silence an empire, that a book, handed to a convict in winter, can keep a soul from freezing. He was not nostalgic for the past. He was protective of the human future. He wanted a modernity with a conscience, science with mercy, reform with repentance. And somewhere in the dim light of his Petersburg room, while the city planned its ordered paradise, he leaned over a blank page and whispered the creed that would guide all his remaining work. Let the world be improved. Let man not be explained away. The summer of 1865 in St. Petersburg was hot and airless. The city smelled of damp wood, iron, and human exhaustion. Dostoevsky, now deep in debt, paced across his small apartment on Krasnochayskaya Street, his mind burning with a single question that refused to leave him. What happens when a man convinces himself that morality is only an illusion? He had read the radicals. He knew their slogans. If there is no God, they said, then everything is permitted. To them, crime was a misunderstanding, a failure of education, not a sin. Replace poverty, change the laws, and man would behave. But Dostoevsky, who had lived among killers, knew it was not so simple. He had seen eyes that could justify murder with logic, and yet trembled when a hymn floated through the prison chapel. There was something mysterious in guilt, something not written in any law book. From that torment came his most haunting creation, Rodion Raskolnikov, a young student who kills an old pawnbroker in the name of reason. The murder, Dostoevsky said, was not about greed, it was an experiment. Could a man, by sheer intellect, step beyond good and evil? Could he prove that conscience is merely a superstition of the weak? Raskolnikov's name comes from the Russian word raskol, a split, and that split runs through the novel like a crack through glass. On one side stands the idea, man as logic, as system, as calculation. On the other side, something wordless and trembling, the soul that refuses to be erased. The crime of reason. Raskolnikov kills in broad daylight. The act is mechanical, almost scientific. He believes he is Napoleon, an extraordinary man above moral law. He wipes the blood from his hands, burns his clothes, rationalizes every step. But as the days pass, reason begins to rot inside him. He hears footsteps that are not there. The city's noise becomes a feverish hum. Every knock on the door feels like the knock of eternity. Dostoevsky turns this crime into a mirror. The real punishment is not the police. It is consciousness itself. When you kill what is sacred, you do not become free. You become haunted. The intellect, once worshipped, becomes an executioner. It whispers endlessly, "You are right. You are rational. So why do you still suffer?" Through Raskolnikov's delirium, Dostoevsky mapped the geography of guilt, the slow collapse of a mind that knows the truth but refuses to kneel before it. He understood that guilt is not a social construct. It is the soul remembering its origin. The woman who redeems. In the middle of that darkness appears Sonia, the daughter of a ruined family. She sells her body to keep her siblings alive. In the eyes of society, she has fallen. But Dostoevsky turns the moral lens upside down. Sonia, the sinner, is the only character who still believes in grace. She reads the story of Lazarus to Raskolnikov, the story of a man brought back from the dead. In that moment, the novel stops being a crime story and becomes a resurrection story. Dostoevsky believed that redemption begins not with self-improvement, but with humiliation. One must fall, truly fall, before the soul can rise. Sonia does not argue with Raskolnikov's theories. She simply suffers beside him. Her silence is theology. It says love does not ask if you deserve it. When Raskolnikov finally confesses, it is not logic that breaks him. It is Sonia's tears. The same intellect that justified murder now kneels in front of a woman whom society despised. That reversal, Dostoevsky thought, is the only real revolution, not the overthrow of governments, but the return of compassion to a proud heart. The weight of freedom. In Siberia, where Raskolnikov serves his sentence, Dostoevsky revisits the question that haunted his own life. Can freedom exist without God? He answers not through philosophy, but through suffering. The young murderer learns that freedom is not the absence of chains, it is the courage to accept guilt and responsibility. Without those, freedom decays into chaos or tyranny. The camp becomes a paradoxical Eden. Raskolnikov is surrounded by criminals, but among them he learns humility. He begins to see that even the lowest man carries an image of the divine. His redemption is not swift or sentimental. It is slow, grueling, uncertain. But that uncertainty is the essence of faith. To believe while doubting. That is what Dostoevsky called spiritual realism. For him, every human soul is both a courtroom and a cathedral. Within us, the trial never ends, and yet grace is always waiting to be admitted. Crime and punishment was not about sin being punished, it was about sin being transformed. The mirror of humanity. Dostoevsky once said that to understand a man, you must see him at the moment of his greatest guilt. In those moments, the masks fall. The logic, the pride, the ideology, all collapse into a single cry. Why? That cry is the beginning of redemption. Through Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky confronted the modern world's most dangerous idea, that we can build morality without transcendence. He saw where that path led into the cold machinery of the 20th century, where millions would die in the name of theories. To him, the root of every atrocity was not hatred, but abstraction. Loving an idea more than a person. He did not preach dogma, he wrote compassion as rebellion. Against a world obsessed with progress, he offered the scandal of forgiveness. Against the pride of intellect, he offered the weakness of faith. Against the machine, he offered the trembling heartbeat of a single sinner who dares to say, I am guilty. Der Resurrectia. At the end of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov kneels in the dust before Sonia. The sun rises, the river glitters, and Dostoevsky writes one of the quietest sentences in literature. He knew he was resurrected and he wept. There is no thunder, no angels, no miracle. Only two people, broken, forgiven, alive. That is Dostoevsky's theology. Not that the righteous are saved, but that the fallen can be reborn. Every man, no matter how monstrous, still carries within him the faint echo of paradise. And perhaps that is why Crime and Punishment endures, not as a moral lesson, but as a mirror. It reminds us that the line between good and evil does not run between classes, nations, or beliefs. It runs through every human heart. Before Crime and Punishment, there was another mirror, smaller and more distorted. A fever dream of identity called the double. Dostoevsky wrote it when he was still young, still believing in reason, still half in love with the Western idea of the perfect self. Yet, what emerged was not a celebration of the rational man, but a nightmare of his disintegration. It was as if the ink itself rebelled against his optimism. The story follows Golyadkin, a timid bureaucrat in St. Petersburg who meets his own double, a man identical in face and name but opposite in confidence. The double begins to replace him at work, charm his colleagues, seduce his dreams. As Golyadkin spirals into paranoia, we realize that the real threat is not supernatural. It is psychological. The double is everything he represses: ambition, envy, pride, made flesh. Dostoevsky, without yet knowing it, had written a prophecy. He had touched the great fracture that would later define his work, the war within the self. Long before Freud, he sensed that man is not one but many. Inside every consciousness lies a courtroom of conflicting witnesses, reason arguing with instinct, morality pleading with desire, faith trembling before doubt. The double was the first ghost in his gallery of human contradictions. But the double was rejected, ridiculed. Critics mocked it as incoherent, grotesque. It nearly destroyed his career. Dostoevsky fell into debt and despair. He began to understand, painfully, that he was not meant to be a writer of manners or progress like Turgenev. He was meant to descend into the labyrinth of the human soul, where mirrors multiply and logic collapses. From that descent, a new voice would be born: the underground man. The birth of the Underground Notes from Underground appeared in 1864, and with it, Dostoevsky invented modern existentialism. Its narrator is nameless, living alone in a basement of St. Petersburg, poor, bitter, brilliant, and self-aware to the point of self-destruction. He addresses us directly. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. But what follows is not confession. It is a war declaration against every system that tries to define him. The underground man hates the utopian dreamers who believe that perfect institutions will perfect mankind. He mocks their mathematical morality, the idea that happiness can be engineered like a bridge. 2 times 2 makes 4, he sneers. Is not life, gentlemen? It is the beginning of death. He would rather suffer freely than live comfortably as a cog. He knows that reason can describe the world, but cannot forgive it. In his Underground, Dostoevsky placed the voice of modern consciousness itself. Brilliant, self-aware, paralyzed. The underground man cannot act because he sees through everything. Every motive reveals selfishness. Every gesture conceals vanity. To know oneself completely, Dostoevsky suggests, is to lose the ability to love. The more conscious we become, the less we can surrender. Intelligence, when severed from grace, becomes a cage of mirrors. The philosophy of rebellion. At the heart of the Underground lies a paradox that would haunt Dostoevsky for the rest of his life. Man desires freedom, but he also desires the destruction that freedom allows. The underground man declares, "What is man without will? A piano key." He would rather choose pain than live without choice. This was Dostoevsky's warning to an age rushing toward determinism, the belief that human behavior can be predicted, programmed, and perfected. He saw the danger not only in politics, but in psychology itself. If every act is the product of causes, then no one is truly responsible. And without responsibility, morality evaporates. Man becomes not evil, but irrelevant. The underground man laughs at this future. You think you will cure me with statistics? I will spite your statistics. His spite is tragic, yet holy. The last cry of individuality before the age of automation. This is where Dostoevsky diverges from the philosophers of despair. For him, the problem was not consciousness itself, but the absence of love within it. The underground man sees everything, but forgives nothing. He is intelligence without humility, rebellion without tenderness. His suffering is self-chosen, an endless analysis of his own motives, a refusal to kneel or to believe. He is the first truly modern soul, bleeding from the wound of self-awareness, the mirror of the modern age. The underground man is not just a character. He is an ancestor of us all, the sarcastic voice in every late-night reflection that asks, what's the point? He predicted the isolation of the modern individual, trapped between self-knowledge and emptiness. He saw the world of comfort coming, the glowing windows, the endless consumption, the shallow freedom, and he whispered, "You will hate it, because you will no longer suffer, and without suffering, you will not feel alive." For Dostoevsky, suffering was not a curse. It was the last proof of being human. Pain reminded man that he still had a soul, that he was more than the sum of his desires. The underground man's agony was not nihilism. It was the scream of a creature made for transcendence but confined to reason. And yet, in that confinement, Dostoevsky saw the possibility of grace. The man who rejects God may still find him. Not in argument, but in exhaustion. When pride burns itself to ashes, the smallest act of humility becomes salvation. A tear can baptize where logic fails. The descent and the foreshadowing. In writing notes from underground, Dostoevsky performed a kind of spiritual archaeology. He dug beneath the ruins of Enlightenment optimism to uncover the raw clay of the human condition. What he found was not progress, but paradox. Man wants heaven, but he also wants hell. He wants truth, but he loves the lie that flatters him. He wants community, but he clings to his ego like a dying god. The underground was both confession and exorcism. Dostoevsky had looked into himself and found the rebellion he would later assign to Ivan Karamazov, the refusal to accept a world built on innocent suffering. But even in that rebellion, he sensed the shadow of love. The underground man denies grace, yet every page trembles with the longing for it. In this way, Dostoevsky turned blasphemy into a form of prayer. He closed the book not with resolution, but with an ellipsis, as if to say, the story continues in you. For he knew that every century would build its own underground, each more comfortable, more illuminated, more alone. Epilogue to a descent. The world ignored the underground man at first, as it had ignored the double. But Dostoevsky had written the seed of the modern conscience. Nietzsche would echo it, Kafka would live inside it, and the 20th century would prove it. Whenever a man says, "I see through everything," the underground man nods from the shadows. Whenever society builds a perfect order and a voice whispers, "What if I don't want to be perfect?" that voice is his. Dostoevsky did not celebrate the underground. He warned against staying there. Awareness without love becomes despair. Freedom without grace becomes cruelty. To rise, the soul must find again what the machine cannot simulate: repentance, forgiveness, the trembling beauty of a single human heart, daring to believe again. By the late 1870s, Dostoevsky was no longer the young radical of the Petrushevsky Circle or the starving journalist of the 1840s. He had survived prison, exile, debt, epilepsy, and humiliation. He had seen the death of his children and the rise of revolutions. And out of that long descent, he began to write what he knew would be his last and greatest testament: the Brothers Karamazov. It was not merely a novel, it was a cathedral. Every brick laid with tears, every arch built with argument. Inside it, Dostoevsky gathered the whole human family: the believer, the skeptic, the sensualist, the saint, and let them fight beneath the roof of God. At the center stood three brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, and Aliosha. They were not characters. They were dimensions of the soul. Dmitri was passion, flesh, chaos, hunger for life. Ivan was intellect, rebellion, the proud fire of reason. Aliosha was faith, humility, compassion, the trembling love that forgives. And around them loomed the father, Fyodor Karamazov, a grotesque, drunken clown who mocks God with his own existence. When he is murdered, each son must confront the truth of what he carries inside, that no one kills alone, that every act of violence is the echo of countless smaller denials of love. Dostoevsky once wrote, "We are all responsible for all." In the Brothers Karamazov, he made that conviction incarnate. Ivan's rebellion. If Crime and Punishment asked whether man can live without guilt, the Brothers Karamazov asked whether man can live with it. The heart of the book, and perhaps the heart of Dostoevsky's entire life, lies in Ivan Karamazov's rebellion. Ivan is the modern thinker, brilliant and rational, who cannot reconcile the existence of God with the suffering of innocent children. He does not deny God's existence. He rejects his world. He presents his brother Aliosha with a litany of atrocities, children beaten, tortured, starved, and then delivers his verdict. "I respectfully return my ticket." He means the ticket to paradise, the heaven bought with suffering. He will not accept it. It is the purest, most noble rebellion ever written in literature. And Dostoevsky took it seriously. He did not silence Ivan. He let him speak fully, devastatingly. Because Dostoevsky himself had once stood on the same ground, a young man in chains, asking why the innocent must bleed while heaven watches. But then, he added something that philosophy could not predict: Ivan's vision of the devil. The Devil's Whisper. Late in the novel, Ivan hallucinates, or dreams, a visitor. A shabby gentleman in worn clothes, polite, articulate, utterly banal. This is not the horned demon of medieval art. This devil is modern, ironic, weary. He doesn't tempt with grand evil, he tempts with small comfort. "Why so serious?" he asks. "Laugh at everything. Nothing matters anyway." In that one scene, Dostoevsky captured the new face of evil. Not hatred, but indifference. Not destruction, but the slow corrosion of meaning. The devil tells Ivan what every century since has wanted to hear: that there is no guilt, no sin, no eternal consequence. Only the mechanical dance of causes and effects. "Relax," he says. "You are merely the byproduct of history." Ivan's intellect collapses under that unbearable freedom. He becomes what Dostoevsky feared most: a man who knows the truth but cannot live it. He believes in justice, but without God it becomes impossible. He believes in morality, but without eternity it becomes arbitrary. His rebellion turns to madness because his heart cannot bear the logic of his own reason. The devil doesn't conquer him with fire. He conquers him with laughter. Alyosha's answer. Opposite. Ivan stands Alyosha, gentle, almost fragile, often dismissed as naive. But in Aliosha, Dostoevsky offered not an argument, but an experience. The presence of love that endures suffering without explanation. He serves the dying monk Zosima, who teaches that faith is not a theory, but a way of seeing. A vision in which every soul, even the most broken, is infinitely precious. Alyosha does not solve Ivan's questions. He lives them. He weeps with those who suffer, listens without condemning, forgives without superiority. In one of the novel's most luminous moments, a group of peasant children gather around him after a funeral. He tells them, "You must remember that there is nothing more precious than love. When you have it, you will forgive all the world." It sounds simple, but in Dostoevsky's cosmology, this is the most radical statement possible. For him, love was not sentimental, it was metaphysical rebellion. In a world that insists on reason and justice, love says, I will forgive even when I understand. That is the one thing the devil cannot imitate. The rebellion of the heart. Dostoevsky was not trying to destroy Ivan's question. He was trying to save the man who asked it. He agreed that the suffering of the innocent is intolerable, but he believed that the answer cannot come from intellect alone. It must come from the broken heart that still loves. In that sense, Aliosha's compassion is not the opposite of Ivan's reason. It is its redemption. To Dostoevsky, rebellion is holy until it forgets love. Then it becomes hell. Ivan's rebellion without mercy births ideology. Aliosha's mercy without rebellion becomes passivity. Between them, Dostoevsky placed the fragile bridge of grace, the idea that truth and love are one, and that separation between them is the tragedy of man. In the end, the Brothers Karamazov is not about who killed the father. It is about who will take responsibility for the wound. Dmitri's passion, Ivan's rebellion, Aliosha's compassion, all are parts of the same soul seeking reconciliation. The novel closes not with triumph, but with the faint music of children's voices, the beginning of forgiveness. The final battle. When Dostoevsky finished the book, he was ill, his hands shaking, his lungs bleeding. He knew it would be his last. He wrote it not as a man preaching doctrine, but as one who had seen hell and still believed in heaven. He told his wife, "If they read this after I'm gone, they will understand what I meant by God." That God was not the God of institutions or dogma, but the God of the trembling human heart, the one that rebels and forgives in the same breath. For Dostoevsky, salvation was never about purity. It was about the courage to love even when love seems unreasonable. It was the defiance of despair, the rebellion of the heart against the tyranny of meaninglessness. And perhaps that is why the Brothers Karamazov endures, because it does not tell us what to believe. It shows us that to live at all is already to believe, to risk faith in a world that breaks our hearts, and yet whispers still through the tears of children, "Love them, for there is nothing else." In the final years of his life, Fyodor Dostoevsky began to write not as a man searching for God, but as one haunted by his silence. He had faced the abyss and found it still whispering the name of Christ. For him, faith was not a fortress. It was a wound that refused to close. Every page he wrote after the Brothers Karamazov trembled with one question. How can a man love God when the world keeps breaking his image? He did not write theology. He wrote suffering. And in that suffering, he found something that no philosopher could define. A vision of Christ not as judge or symbol, but as a face. A human face, radiant and wounded, calm amid the chaos of history. To Dostoevsky, that face was the last refuge against madness. The one thing that could still say yes to life after everything else had said no. The shadow of the Grand Inquisitor. The most terrifying passage in The Brothers Karamazov is not the murder or the madness. It is the legend of the Grand Inquisitor. Ivan tells his brother a story, perhaps a dream, perhaps a confession, about Christ returning to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. The crowd recognizes him, weeps, worships, but the church arrests him. That night, the Grand Inquisitor visits the cell. He tells Christ that he is no longer needed. "You gave men freedom," he says, "but they cannot bear it. We will fix what you began." He explains that humanity does not want the terror of choice. They want bread, miracle, and authority. So the church will take his place. They will give the people happiness without freedom. And the most terrible line follows: "We have corrected your work." Christ listens silently. He says nothing. He only kisses the Inquisitor on the lips. The old man shudders, opens the door, and whispers, "Go, and come no more." Dostoevsky called that legend his central confession. It was the drama of all history, compressed into one parable: man's longing to worship something, and his fear of what true faith demands. Faith in the machinery of power. In that single story, Dostoevsky saw how every system, political, scientific, even religious, risks becoming an imitation of the Inquisitor. The world promises safety, stability, equality, but at the cost of the soul's freedom. The machine of progress offers bread instead of meaning, comfort instead of conscience. Dostoevsky's Christ refuses that trade. He does not rule, persuade, or coerce. He stands silent, powerless, vulnerable, and in that weakness lies his divinity. He does not promise paradise through laws or revolutions. He promises it through compassion. For Dostoevsky, this was not sentimentality. It was rebellion against every empire that claimed to save humanity while crushing the heart that makes humanity sacred. He wrote, "If truth can be achieved only through the death of love, then I choose love." That was his final heresy and his final faith. The face in the darkness. As his health deteriorated, Dostoevsky began to dream of a world stripped of illusions, no churches, no kings, no doctrines, only the solitary soul before the mystery of existence. In those moments, he returned to the image of Christ, not the resurrected God of triumph, but the suffering man of empathy. The Christ who weeps beside Lazarus before calling him back to life. The Christ who washes the feet of the one who will betray him. To Dostoevsky, this was the final answer to nihilism. Not an argument, but a gesture. In the face of absurdity, to love anyway. That was what the underground man could never do. That was what Raskolnikov had to learn. That was what Ivan, in his rebellion, still longed for. He once told a friend, "If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth, and that the truth is outside Christ, I would still choose to remain with Christ rather than with the truth." It is perhaps the most radical statement of faith ever written. Not belief in doctrine, but allegiance to love itself. The final temptation. Dostoevsky's last temptation was not atheism, it was despair. The temptation to believe that evil had finally won, that human beings were too cruel, too blind, too tired to be redeemed. The same temptation that Jesus faced in the desert, to abandon faith for certainty, to turn stones into bread. In the Grand Inquisitor, that temptation is universal. It is the promise of an easy salvation, one without freedom, suffering, or love. Dostoevsky rejected it, not because he believed in perfection, but because he believed in the possibility of forgiveness. His entire life was a war between skepticism and mercy, and he chose mercy again and again, even when it made no sense. He had seen too much cruelty to believe in innocence, but he had also seen too much compassion to believe in damnation. For him, faith was not a solution. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to give up on meaning. To the face of Christ. In his final public appearance, months before his death, Dostoevsky spoke to a crowd about the painting Christ in the Tomb by Holbein. The image shows the dead Christ, lifeless, pale, almost decomposing, so real it shocks the believer. Dostoevsky said he could not look at it for long, and yet he returned to it constantly. Why? Because that corpse was the measure of faith. If God could truly die, then love was stronger than reason. The image was unbearable and therefore sacred. He saw in that face the reconciliation of everything he had ever written. The agony of Raskolnikov, the rebellion of Ivan, the humility of Aliosha, the despair of the underground man, all brought to silence before the broken, human God who who refuses to stop loving the world that kills him. A quiet victory. Dostoevsky's Christ does not conquer the world, he redeems it, one trembling heart at a time. His victory is quiet, the whisper of forgiveness that survives every catastrophe. In that whisper, Dostoevsky found peace. He wrote until his body failed, until his lungs filled with blood, until his final breath. And with that breath, he still believed that love, irrational, impossible, divine, was the only answer strong enough to face despair. His last words to his wife were simple: "Don't weep, we are not lost." He died with the Bible open beside him, the story of the prodigal son on the page, the eternal return of the sinner to the embrace of mercy. By the time Dostoevsky reached the end of his life, suffering had become not his subject, but his language. It was the grammar through which he understood existence. Every sentence in his novels born from pain, every revelation shaped by despair. He had come to believe that only those who have suffered deeply can see the world as it truly is, fragile, luminous, in need of forgiveness. He once said, "I do not believe in suffering for its own sake. I believe that through it, we discover our humanity." To most, that sounds cruel. But for Dostoevsky, suffering was not a punishment. It was a threshold. Through it, the soul learns empathy, humility, and finally, the terrifying freedom to love without demand. The prison of paradise. He had seen the opposite of suffering. He had seen indifference. In the salons of Europe, in the manifestos of socialists, in the sterile philosophies of progress, he sensed a strange coldness. They spoke of equality, but not compassion, of utopia, but not mercy. They wanted to build paradise by eliminating pain, not by redeeming it. To Dostoevsky, that was the most dangerous illusion of all. A paradise without tears, a world anesthetized against the heart. If you remove suffering, he warned, you remove the possibility of love. He did not glorify agony, he humanized it. Because in his eyes, a man who has never suffered cannot forgive, and a man who cannot forgive cannot be free. The fire that purifies. In the Brothers Karamazov, Zosima tells his monks that salvation begins when you take responsibility not just for yourself, but for all. There is no one who is not guilty before everyone else. It is a terrifying idea, that my suffering is connected to yours, that I am somehow answerable for the wounds of the world. But in that shared guilt, Dostoevsky found redemption. He believed that compassion is not born from ideology or education, but from brokenness. Only when your own heart cracks can another's pain reach you. The more I love humanity in general, he wrote, the less I love people in particular. He was confessing the modern disease, the love of abstractions over faces. His cure was simple: suffer with someone. Sit beside them. Do not analyze their pain. Feel it. Carry it. Only then does the soul expand beyond the ego. In that way, suffering became for him not the enemy of happiness, but its twin. Happiness without suffering is shallow. Suffering without love is despair. But suffering embraced as love becomes transformation. The return from the abyss. In 1849, when Dostoevsky stood before the firing squad, he had only seconds left to live. He watched the blindfolded men beside him tremble, the rifles raised, the world frozen between heartbeat and eternity. And then, suddenly, a reprieve arrived. The execution was a performance, a cruel trick staged by the Tsar. His sentence was changed to years of labor in Siberia. He would later say that those few seconds of death changed him more than all the years that followed. When he saw the sunlight afterward, every leaf, every breath, every smile became sacred. He had been resurrected without dying, and that paradox, life renewed through suffering, became the spiritual foundation of all his later work. He realized that the abyss does not only destroy, it reveals. It shows what truly matters, the small acts of mercy that make existence bearable, the simple beauty of being alive despite the horror. To be too aware, he wrote, is sickness. But to love despite that awareness, that is healing. The saint in the gutter. Dostoevsky's characters were rarely noble. They were murderers, prostitutes, beggars, and dreamers. But he saw in them something holier than moral perfection, the spark of redemption. He wanted to prove that grace does not descend upon the pure. It blossoms in the dirt. The saint, he believed, is not the one who never sins, but the one who never stops repenting. Sonia, who reads scripture through her tears. Prince Mishkin, whose compassion makes him seem insane. Aliosha, who forgives before he understands. All of them are fragments of Dostoevsky himself, testaments to his faith that even in the darkest corner of the soul, light can still be born. He once said that beauty will save the world, but by beauty, he did not mean aesthetics. He meant spiritual beauty, the radiance of love in a suffering heart. That beauty, he thought, is the only force powerful enough to defeat cruelty because it does not fight. It transforms. The weight of compassion. To suffer deeply is to see clearly, but clarity is a burden. In his later years, Dostoevsky would walk through the streets of St. Petersburg and feel the ache of the city as if it were his own body. The hungry, the desperate, the forgotten. He wrote that every time he saw a child beg for bread, he felt the same guilt as if he had stolen it himself. This was not neurosis. It was a vision of the world bound together by invisible pain. For him, to live consciously was to live responsibly. And yet, even in that unbearable awareness, he found joy, the kind that cannot be purchased or taught. It was the joy of carrying the cross and discovering that it was lighter than expected. The prophet of the human heart. As his fame grew, people began to call Dostoevsky a prophet. He despised the title. "I am not a prophet," he said. "I am a witness." He did not claim to foresee the future. He only saw the pattern that repeats in every generation. The attempt to build heaven without grace, to abolish suffering without love. His warning was simple and eternal. Every paradise without compassion will become a prison. Every ideology that promises salvation through systems will end in cruelty. And every heart that refuses to suffer will forget how to love. He was not asking humanity to worship pain. He was asking it to remember its soul. To let suffering teach humility, not despair. Tenderness, not bitterness. Because only through that narrow passage does man encounter what is most divine in himself. The final vision. Near the end of his life, Dostoevsky told his wife that he had finally found peace. "I have suffered much," he said, "but I would not trade it for all the happiness in the world." He no longer saw suffering as the enemy of faith. It had become the crucible through which faith was purified, not belief in dogma, but belief in goodness. In every novel, every confession, every trembling line, he whispered the same truth. "Blessed are they who suffer, for through them the world is redeemed." It was not a slogan. It was his final prayer. By the dawn of the 1880s, Dostoevsky's life had become a quiet storm. He lived in a small apartment in St. Petersburg with his wife Anna and their children. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and ink, of the damp Russian winter pressing against the windows. Outside, the city groaned under industrial smoke and poverty, the empire in decay. Inside, Dostoevsky wrote as if every line might be his last. His lungs were weak. His seizures came more often. But there was a strange serenity in him now, a calm that comes not from escape, but from understanding. After a lifetime spent wrestling with the darkness of the human soul, he had begun to see the faint light that flickers even within the worst of us. The weight of mortality. Every morning, Anna would find him at his desk before dawn, coughing, praying, writing. The manuscripts were covered in fine, deliberate handwriting, like the confession of a man who knew that every word might carry eternity's weight. He had made peace with death long ago, at the firing squad, in the mines, in the epileptic fits that stole minutes from his life. But now, for the first time, he did not fear it. He saw it as part of the same mysterious order that had shaped all his pain and love. He once told Anna, "When you have suffered enough, you stop fighting the end. You begin to listen to it." Death, to him, was not the opposite of life. It was the completion of it. The final reconciliation between the screaming soul and the silence that created it. The writer of Russia's soul. By then, Russia had begun to see him not as a novelist, but as a prophet. Crowds gathered at his readings, letters poured in from all corners of the empire. Young students saw him as a spiritual guide in a nation collapsing under cynicism. But fame brought him no pride. He saw it as a burden, another cross to carry. "They think I speak from wisdom," he said, "but I only speak from wounds." He watched the political radicals of his time with both sympathy and dread. He had once shared their rage against tyranny, but now he feared their vision. A paradise built by force, a kingdom without compassion. They love mankind, he warned, but not the man standing before them. In his last public address, delivered to a crowd of thousands, Dostoevsky spoke not of revolution, but of forgiveness. He urged Russia to find salvation not in ideology, but in the heart. He told them that Christ's love, not the sword, was the only path strong enough to heal the rift tearing their nation apart. When he finished, the hall was silent. Then, slowly, people began to weep. The Gospel of Tears. By that time, Dostoevsky's writing had transcended literature. It had become a form of prayer, one addressed not to God above, but to the God within man. He wrote as if each sentence could reach the conscience of a stranger centuries away. His home became a kind of sanctuary. Visitors would describe how he would pause mid-conversation, close his eyes, and murmur softly, as though listening to something invisible. "He speaks," one friend said, "as if God is sitting beside him." And yet, even in that near mystical peace, he still carried sorrow. The memory of his first wife, his dead children, the ghosts of prison, they never left him. They followed him like shadows through every novel. But instead of fleeing from them, he began to speak to them. In his journal, he wrote, "The tears of my past are not wasted, they water the roots of my faith." That line captures the man he had become, not triumphant, not saintly, but reconciled. The return to childhood. One of Dostoevsky's favorite books was the Gospel of Luke. In his final months, he read it every night before bed. He kept it beside his pillow, like a relic. When he opened it, his hands trembled not from age, but from awe. He was drawn especially to the parable of the prodigal son, the story of a child who wastes everything and returns home in shame, only to be embraced by his father. For Dostoevsky, this was not just scripture. It was autobiography. He saw himself in that son, the rebel, the sinner, the doubter, the one who had cursed heaven and yet found himself loved all the same. "If God exists," he wrote, "he is not the judge I once feared. He is the father who runs to meet me on the road." That vision of unconditional love became his final theology and the heart of all his fiction. It was why Raskolnikov confesses, why Sonia forgives, why Aliosha prays. Every story was a rehearsal for that reunion between guilt and mercy. Light through the smoke. On February 9th, 1881, the city was frozen under gray skies. Dostoevsky sat in his chair, his Bible open to the story of Lazarus. He had been coughing blood for days. His face was pale, but calm. Anna knelt beside him. He whispered, "You must not weep. We are not lost." Moments later, he slipped into silence. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and tobacco. The smoke rose gently toward the ceiling, like a final offering. At his funeral, tens of thousands of people followed the coffin through the streets of St. Petersburg. Peasants, students, soldiers, beggars, aristocrats. The whole of Russia seemed to walk behind him. Some carried candles, others carried copies of his books. Many simply wept. They called him the conscience of the nation. But Dostoevsky would have smiled at that. He never claimed to be pure. He had only tried to tell the truth. That man is terrible and divine in the same breath, and that love is the only bridge strong enough to cross that contradiction. The silence that remains. In the century that followed, the world would change beyond recognition. Wars, revolutions, machines, gods made and destroyed. But Dostoevsky's voice would remain, echoing softly through it all. When faith collapses, his words whisper, "Do not despair." When ideology rages, they murmur, "Remember compassion." When the world forgets the soul, they remind, "There is no man without God, and no God without man." He had lived his life in the smoke of suffering, but in the end, he found light. Not the blinding light of revelation, but the fragile glow of mercy, the kind that flickers quietly in the heart and refuses to go out. And perhaps that was his final message to humanity. That even when the air is thick with ashes, when hope seems buried beneath history's ruins, a single act of love, no matter how small, is enough to keep the fire alive. When Dostoevsky died, the world did not yet understand what he had left behind. He had not given Russia a philosophy, nor the church a theology. What he gave was something far rarer, a mirror for the human soul. A mirror that does not flatter, does not console, but also does not condemn. It simply reflects the truth of being alive, broken, yearning, luminous, and unfinished. His novels were not sermons. They were confessions of an age that had lost God and could not bear the silence that followed. He did not solve the problem of evil. He made it human. He did not erase despair. He gave it a voice. And in giving it a voice, he transformed it into prayer. The eternal return of the human heart. In his last years, Dostoevsky began to sense something that philosophers would later call the eternal return, not in Nietzsche's cosmic sense, but in a spiritual one. To him, every soul, every sinner, every saint, every murderer, every mother, repeats the same story: fall, despair, repentance, grace. The pattern of the human heart is circular, not linear. Each generation returns to the same crossroads: love or power, mercy or pride, faith or nihilism. History changes its clothes, but the battle remains the same. Dostoevsky's genius was to show that this battle happens not in parliaments or wars, but within the quiet chambers of conscience. When Raskolnikov kneels before Sonia, when Ivan argues with the devil, when the underground man mocks himself, these are not scenes from the 19th century. They are eternal moments. They happen again and again in every human life. Each time, a soul must choose between cynicism and compassion. The gospel of contradiction. Dostoevsky's world was built on paradox, freedom and guilt, faith and doubt, love and suffering. He refused to simplify them because he believed that truth itself is paradoxical, that the divine hides within the contradictions of the human. He once wrote, "The mystery of man is not that he is capable of evil, but that he still loves goodness after seeing it fail." That single sentence may be the most profound definition of the soul ever written. For Dostoevsky, The soul is not the place where virtue lives. It's the battlefield where good and evil wrestle until the end of time. What matters is not victory, but struggle. The decision to keep fighting when you no longer believe you can win. That was his faith, not in success, but in endurance. Not in purity, but in persistence. Not in a flawless God, but in a God who stays with the flawed. A prophet for the future. A century after his death, his words began to sound prophetic. The ideologies he warned against, the systems that promised heaven on earth, erupted into revolutions, gulags, and wars. Humanity discovered that paradise built without mercy becomes hell. Dostoevsky had seen it coming, but he also foresaw something gentler, that even after the ruins, people would still search for meaning. That behind every machine, every government, every empire, there would still beat the same lonely heart of a single individual, trembling before the mystery of existence. Today, in an age of noise and distraction, his voice still cuts through, soft but unyielding. Man is not made for happiness. He is made for the miracle of becoming human. That miracle, he believed, was renewed every time a person chose love over pride, forgiveness over hatred, faith over despair. In those moments, the soul is reborn, again and again, eternally. The God that suffers for Dostoevsky, God was not an answer, but a companion, the silent witness to man's agony. In his final notebooks, he wrote, "If God exists, he suffers with us." It was a heresy to theologians and a revelation to artists. He imagined not a distant ruler, but a divine presence that shares our hunger, our madness, our tears. In Christ, he saw not perfection, but participation. God, to him, was the eternal partner of the human journey, the infinite who chooses to walk through the finite. That was the secret behind all his stories, that salvation does not descend from above, but rises from within, from the soul that refuses to stop loving in a loveless world, the light that never dies. What Dostoevsky left us is not doctrine, but light, a fragile light that survives through suffering. It flickers in the dark corners of his novels, in the trembling voice of a murderer asking for forgiveness, in the quiet faith of a woman who prays for the one who wronged her. It is the light that says, even here, even now, grace is possible. In a letter written weeks before his death, he said, "There is something eternal in every human being, a divine spark that cannot be drowned by sin or despair." That, perhaps, was his true belief, that the human soul is the mirror through which eternity sees itself. The return of the soul. So the circle closes. The man who once stood before a firing squad, broken, condemned, faithless, ended his life surrounded by love, writing about redemption. The same man who once declared himself an atheist died with the words of the gospel on his lips. He did not find answers. He found peace, and that peace did not erase suffering. It transfigured it. The eternal return of the soul, for Dostoevsky, is not reincarnation or destiny. It is the eternal possibility of renewal. The soul may fall, may betray, may despair, but it can always rise again. Because love, once awakened, cannot truly die. As he wrote in his journal, "I believe that the heart of man is deeper than the abyss, because love has no bottom." That was his final sermon, the last light through the smoke. Fade to silence. Imagine him now, the old apartment dimly lit, his Bible open, the ink still drying on the page. Outside, the snow keeps falling over St. Petersburg, soft as forgiveness. The city sleeps, the world turns. Somewhere, a reader opens one of his books, breathes, and feels less alone. That, more than fame or philosophy, is Dostoevsky's resurrection, the quiet return of the soul in those who still listen. Because as long as even one person chooses compassion over cruelty, His words will remain true. The mystery of human existence lies not in staying alive, but in finding something to live for. And that, in the end, is all he ever tried to teach.